The role of gas will be very important to make sure the system remains reliable for a while yet, but it won't be big volumes of gas. That's a very different role for gas. I don't think we'll be a country that burns a lot of gas. We're going to move away from burning gas in our homes for all the purposes that most of us do. I think a lot of industrial applications for gas will progressively be replaced by something like hydrogen. In fact, if anything, in the mid-2030s, we might even see an increase in the importance of the role of gas, but the role will be not as a transition fuel, but as a backstop.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hugo Batten, the Managing Director of Aurora in Australia. We're very much looking forward to today's discussion. We have Tony Wood in today, the head of the Grattan Institute's energy program and one of Australia's most prolific energy writers and thinkers. Tony's had a lengthy career in energy, working for Origin Energy, the Clinton Foundation, Incitec Pivot, amongst other organisations. He also writes regularly in the Australian Financial Review and other Oz publications on energy, and he's been a great friend to Aurora over the years and chairs our Australian advisory panel here in Australia. Tony, welcome to Energy Unplugged. We're delighted you can join us.
Yes, Hugo, I'm also very pleased to be here. In the interest of mutual recognition, I respected the work that Aurora has done for a long time, initially from afar, and now that you've been in Australia for a few years, I think you're making a very sound contribution to the broad understanding of the way our energy markets are working.
That's very kind. Well, let's dive right in, Tony, and kick off with a discussion of kind of Australian energy politics. A lot of our listeners are kind of European based, and I think sometimes they look at the domestic debate in Australia and kind of wonder what's going on and where it deviated from the consensus in Europe and the UK. So kind of casting your mind back 10 years, where do you think that the energy debate in Australia potentially took a wrong turn? Is it a structural factor, the federal-state split? Was it particular policy areas? Or was it the personalities involved, Rudd, Turnbull, Gillard and others?
Look, I think many Australians would wonder how we ended up where we are. I think one of the answers is somewhat tried, is that if you want to get something this wrong, you've got to try really hard. And we've tried all those things you mentioned, and they came together in all sorts of interesting ways. Look, at the centre of it, I think there are two issues. One was the fact that Australia, more so than many OECD countries, started a long way back in terms of our emissions intensity per capita, for example. That means we had a lot further to go. And with a largely fossil fuel-based energy sector in particular, that created some challenges. And certainly for the first part of this century, our large businesses were not helpful, let's put it that way. However, the thing that really, I think, put us going in a very difficult direction was the politics, pure, naked politics. And I think we all know that when politics and good policy clash, there's only going to be one winner, and it's always politics. And so, when Tony Abbott rolled Malcolm Turnbull as leader of the Liberal Party, and of course he returned the favour not long after, some years after, that was the beginning, because what people saw was political opportunism, that if you can strike quickly and use a particular issue to establish a beachhead, it can be very powerful. And in Tony Abbott's case, it turned out to be powerful not only to wrest control of the Liberal Party from Malcolm Turnbull, but also then to win an election against Labor on the basis of getting rid of basically a relatively simple, straightforward fixed price emissions trading scheme. And we've never recovered. Neither side of politics is prepared now to go back to what you would see most people would call the sensible central ground of climate policy.
Do you think the kind of changes internationally, so Biden's election, Japan, Korea, China, all committing to net zero, potentially declining markets for Australia's fossil fuels exports, are going to impact domestic Australian politics over time? Is the pressure going to kind of ramp up on Prime Minister Morrison?
Well, this year there's two things happening. One is the COP26 in Glasgow, and that'll be obviously impacted by the United States rejoining the club. And the second issue, there will be a federal election in Australia sometime between August and this year and May of next year. Look, I think this thing can be over and understated. I think that there will be pressure internationally. And of course, our relationships with the United States, with China, with Korea, with Japan are all fundamentally important to Australia in many different ways, defence, trade, so forth. It depends to some extent what the Biden government actually does, because I think that what they'll do domestically may be very much less than what they can do internationally because of the nature of the political system in the United States. And so that means that Biden's constrained, and if he is constrained, it may mean that puts less pressure on the Australian government to say, well, look, you've just rejoined the club we belong to. You need to catch up with us, and we're doing pretty good, actually. So I think it's going to be a really interesting dynamic, Hugo. Ultimately, domestic politics will be what dictates what the current government, Morrison government, takes to the election whenever the Prime Minister decides to hold it.
Just on that note, so Australian Prime Minister Morrison gave a speech in early February when we were recording this podcast. He is being pushed to commit to net zero by 2050, and he said that's his preference. To some degree, the question is, does it matter, given all the states and territories in Australia have already committed to net zero, as you were very quick to point out? And I suppose the question is, does it matter? And do you think the technology roadmap that the feds have mapped out is a good path to get us there?
Look, I think Morrison, in my view, was absolutely right when he says that there's not much point having a target if we don't know how we're going to get there. But equally, having a target with no policies at all, so equally having policies to get somewhere if you don't know where you're going, is equally unacceptable. And I think what Morrison has cleverly done at the moment is position the argument to say, look, we need technology and we'll get there with technology. And if we don't, the only alternative is taxes. We don't want to tax. Now, of course, the real answer is that this is a false positioning. The real answer is that the best way to deploy technology is through some form of either carrot or stick, some form of incentive or regulation or pricing or taxes, right? And the real issue is, how do we do it at lowest cost? If we can persist with a pure funding of technology approach, then we'll almost certainly make less progress more expensively than if we started to deploy technologies with market mechanisms. But at the moment, politically, that's not on the table. And so the question will be whether or not in the short term ahead, the government and or the opposition can frame basically a messy, complicated, third best set of sector-based policies, which will get us in the right direction, hopefully not too far off course, but will be less efficient. Yeah.
So just for our international listeners, again, the federal government has an important role in the NEM, Australia's national electricity market, but energy is actually more of a state issue. New South Wales, which is Australia's largest state, has rolled out what they've called a roadmap. And again, for our international listeners, it's a little bit more like what we've seen in the UK without carbon pricing. So lots of CFD style auctions to bring on renewables, capacity payments for firming supply, and particularly in Australia where the grid is a real issue for renewables, funding to what's called renewable energy zones. So lots of spending on transmission. Tony, you've been a little bit critical of the policy in the AFR, and I should declare a conflict of interest in that Aurora did the modelling for the New South Wales government on the policy, but Aurora is strictly policy neutral. What areas of the policy most concern you, and how might you have done it differently if you were Minister Keane, the New South Wales Minister for Energy?
Yeah, look, I think it is an interesting question to see how different governments are going about this. And you're right that unusually in the world, the Australian federal system, particularly on energy, makes life a bit more complicated. If they can all work together, it's good, but when they can't, it's not. Now, what we're seeing is an issue that many governments around the world have faced, and that is, at least for the short term, a loss of confidence that the pricing mechanisms in the markets we created, in many cases 20, 30 years ago, can deliver the new investment we need, particularly when that new investment has fundamentally different technical and financial characteristics. Now, they can get highly technical, but that's the basis of it. Governments have just become spooked. And if you're the energy minister, whether it's and particularly in Australia, if you're a state energy minister, you do not want the lights going out on your watch. And that means that an energy minister puts a much heavily emphasis on reliability than they do even on price or reducing emissions, and probably even higher value on reliability than the consumers do. And so what New South Wales was worried about, and still is, that when the coal-fired power stations closed down, and we still have several in New South Wales and other parts of the country in Australia, and this will take place most likely over the next 20 years or so, as they close, will we have what we need to keep the lights on? And a lot of this policy was to address that question. Now, the UK, of course, as you and many of your listeners would know to this podcast, would know that the UK solved the problem with a form of capacity auction. In Australia, the central body that tries to coordinate our national approach has moved away from a centralised capacity auction. They're trying to craft a different alternative, but the New South Wales government became frustrated and said, look, not only are we going to dictate new transmission being built inside our state to connect renewables, we're going to create these areas or groupings of renewables called renewable energy zones, which the government will basically cause to be built. And we will effectively legislate new renewable energy and storage at fixed targets into the future. Now, the two things I've got problems with is not that we shouldn't be worried about these things. Politicians will often be compelled to act. And I fully understand that. The issue here is that a single jurisdiction in an interconnected market does its own thing, and that creates problems. The second thing is, I think, a very poor articulation or even an understanding of risk. Because what's going on here is that governments seem to believe that they can eliminate risk and therefore reduce costs. Now, what actually happens is the risks get transferred from investors to taxpayers or consumers, sometimes without telling those taxpayers and consumers that they now bear these risks of future issues in the market. I don't think it's a very good idea. I think the best answer is to have the minimum necessary amount of planning, and I think there is an argument for transmission being planned, but then leave it up to the investors to decide where they need to build what they want to build. They'll make decisions, they will risk their equity, and they'll make profits if they get it right, and they'll rightly make less profit if they get it wrong. That would be a far better way to do it, rather than believe that an all-singing, all-knowing government can make all those decisions.
Yeah, so you're more comfortable with the transmission element of the New South Wales roadmap. And again, a lot of this has to be defined through the detailed regulation to come. For renewables, it was more the kind of 20-year fixed price contracts that puts risk on, well, not the government, because like the UK, they've created a separate authority to manage those contracts. But that transfer of risk, which theoretically brings down the cost of capital for developers, you think is the issue?
Well, most likely what will happen, and we know this from history, this is one of those things where you do not believe if you do it the same thing again, you're going to get a different answer. This is one of those cases where it will happen again. And we know that when you have central authorities who are given a task of planning a fixed amount of capacity, and one issue I am critical of is that the government locked in a fixed amount of capacity rather than saying, look, let's have a broad objective to maintain a defined level of reliability, and then we can leave it to the market to work out what's the best way to achieve that. That they basically constrained the whole thing. Now, what that means is almost inevitably, we will build things more than we need in the wrong places at the wrong time. Now, most of what we're going to build probably in the long term will be needed. But the idea that you can create this central agency, which is just going to know everything and be all wise, is fairy tale land. I mean, we've tried to do it before. It doesn't work. The best role for government is to impose reliability standards, internalize that externality, if you like, in the same way we should internalize the externality of climate, and then let the market work out the best way to deliver that objective with lowest cost. And I think that we try to do the opposite, we'll keep getting the opposite answer.
Yeah. So are you then more confident? So to your first point, states doing their own things, which potentially adds to cost in that they're not coordinating between them. Are you confident in the Energy Security Board processes and other kind of NEM national level market design programs that they will deliver reforms across states? Or is there something to be said for a bit of competitive tension between states where perhaps New South Wales comes up with a model that other states like and looks good and it evolves in a more kind of organic bottom-up way?
Well, I think the trick is whether that we can get a compromise between the two. It's pretty obvious that when you've got sovereign state governments, and these are sovereign governments, there'll be times when they want to do things themselves. And they will always say, we should all do it the same way, and everybody else should do it the way I want to do it. Now that clearly is a recipe for tension, right? At the very least. An ideal way to do this, and we've tried it before, and I think we could eventually come back to this when we realize the alternative doesn't work very well, is to say that we do have a national agreement. We actually have a written Australian energy market agreement. And it basically says that we should do things in a certain way. There are rules and there are agencies to implement those rules. But we now have a situation where individual jurisdictions are seeking and gaining derogations away from those rules. And as soon as one starts to do it, the others start to do it. Now, the consequence isn't that we don't make progress. The consequence is we make messy progress. It's less efficient. It means very difficult decisions for investors. They've got to second guess all this. Most big companies are trying to deal with the sort of arrangements we've been talking about. Second guessing their investments is hard. It doesn't mean they don't make decisions, but they make different decisions. And from an overall system perspective, those decisions will be less efficient, they'll be higher cost, because the government's attempts to eliminate risk doesn't work. All it does is shift the risk around.
Yeah. If we could change gears slightly, the Grattan Institute's written a ripping report on the role of gas in the energy transition. Guy Dundas and you authored that report. The coal wars, to some degree, feel like they're winding down, and the gas wars are just beginning in Australia. The role of gas in Australia's power sector, how do you see it playing out in the next 10 to 20 years? Do you see a role for gas as backup capacity and to firm renewable generation? Or do you think, and a little bit kind of the view of AEMO, Australia's system operator, that we can transition from a purely renewables plus very long duration storage system without the intervening role for gas in the transition? What's kind of yours and Grattan's house view there?
Look, I think firstly, the original idea of gas as the transition fuel to a low emissions future was one in which gas would replace coal. And that was at a time when gas was cheap and renewables were expensive. That's all switched around. That's gone. That's not going to happen. Although there are people in government who would like to think they could go back to those good old days. That's not the reality. So in the reality in which gas is not cheap and in which we have to reduce emissions, ultimately gas is the fossil fuel, that changes the dynamic. As we move up the renewables share of our power system, we now know we can go a lot further, a lot more cheaply than we had thought. Now, in Australia's case, individual states, which are boasting that they are now 100% renewable, are not cutting the wires to the rest of the states. In fact, if anything, their reliability on the interconnectedness of the electricity system, which is the largest, I think, physical system in the world in terms of kilometres, is becoming greater. Because what happens when I might, on average across the year, grow a lot of tomatoes for myself, but at certain times of the year, I still go and buy tomatoes from the supermarket because I don't have any. Same things happening with respect to renewable energy. And so it's fine for one jurisdiction to have lots of wind, but the wind isn't blowing, they have to get coal-fired power from somewhere else. Now, when we're all depending on the wind, and Australia has a very unusually high correlation of wind and solar resources, that life becomes difficult. Now, it's a lot higher than people used to think. But as we get to 60, 70, 80, 90% wind and solar, I think the argument that we can then maintain the reliability of that system through not really nasty, hot summer weekends or combinations of weekdays, but long, dreary 2 or 3 weeks of low renewable output, I don't think storage cuts it. At least not the storage we understand today. Now, whether or not it makes economic sense to store hydrogen for long periods of time remains to be seen. What we do have is a stored energy form, natural gas, which we didn't pay for putting it there, and we can use that. Now, I think the answer might very well be that the role of gas will become more important, but less volume in the power sector. So it's a bit like getting Dame Judi Dench to do a cameo in your play, right? She might not be on stage for very long, but she attracts the crowd. The role of gas will be very important to make sure the system remains reliable for a while yet, but it won't be big volumes of gas. That's a very different role for gas. I don't think we'll be a country that burns a lot of gas. We're going to move away from burning gas in our homes for all the purposes that most of us do. I think a lot of industrial applications for gas will progressively be replaced by something like hydrogen. But I think the power system will, in fact, if anything, in the mid 2030s, we might even see an increase in the importance of the role of gas. But the role will be not as a transition fuel, but as a backstop.
Terrific, and that, at least under some of Aurora's scenarios, is certainly how we see the Australian market playing out. You touched on transmission there, and it's long been a hard issue in Australia, again, given how long and thin the grid is. There's been a lot of proposals for reform over the years as to how inter-regional and intra-regional transmission is built. The AEMC, Australia's market rulemaker, has suggested what they call CAGATI, which is some combination of kind of nodal pricing and the idea of transmission hedging contracts, so that renewables who want to build out in the middle of nowhere in Australia can do that, but then they need to strike contracts with transmission to incentivize transmission to build out to those regions. What's your view on those CAGATI proposals? You said before that you're not kind of adverse to central planning from a transmission perspective. Do you think CAGATI solves that problem, or should we just kind of grit our teeth and do a little bit more central planning here?
I think this is the trick in a number of areas of our economy, and certainly in energy, where we embraced markets. And broadly speaking, when I say markets, I mean well-regulated markets. I don't mean sort of some weird concept of free markets. But we seem to have lost confidence in those markets. And secondly, basically the carving up of the energy supply chain into the competitive sections and the areas that will be subject to economic regulation, like the monopoly networks. Some of those barriers are breaking down, Hugo. And I think what we're now grappling with is, where do we feel comfortable in respect of planning versus markets? And so the idea was that we would build these transmission lines. They would just be there to connect big parts of the country with energy when it was needed. But broadly speaking, investment would flow from the private sector. But now we've got a problem, because if we're thinking about building all these distributed energy resources, particularly wind and solar, in large solar farms and wind farms, connecting those becomes much more difficult, because you could spend an enormous amount on transmission to connect them all and be very inefficient in the process. So how do you coordinate that? So CAGATI is one of the ugliest acronyms I've ever come across: coordination of generation and transmission investment. Now, some degree of coordination is a good idea. We don't have people just merrily building roads all over the bloody place every time someone wants to build a new factory or a new shop, right? Someone says, right, this is where we're going to build the roads. But they don't say, oh, and by the way, this is where we're going to build the supermarket. This is where we're going to build the Tesco. This is where we're going to everything, right? So getting what needs to be planned, and then what do you leave to people to invest in? And then this is where the trick is. Now, I think the idea of having some form of locational marginal pricing may be a good idea. And I know the Energy Security Board is very strongly committed to that, and some form of firm transmission rights. Now, I think what happened in Australia is a lot of renewable energy investors got their fingers burnt because they really didn't do their homework and really understand what risks they were taking when they built a wind farm or a solar farm in a particular part of the grid, and were then subject to possible congestion on that grid. A lot of them now understand that. I don't think we should remove that risk entirely. I think it's a really bad idea, because eventually you'll end up with the whole thing being a regulated monopoly in a sense. I think we should be making sure that the planning part of it, the important part of the planning, building the backbone, of the transmission system needs to be done by a central body. I don't think it should be the body necessarily that owns and operates that grid. And then you leave it up to the private sector to decide whether they want to build their wind farms and solar farms under a very clear set of rules. I think we'll emerge to something like that. There's no perfect answer, and there will be changes in the dynamic between this, the planning part and the market part always. But I think to go too far to either extreme is a bad idea.
Yeah, and to kind of go back to what we were talking about on the state governments being increasingly active in their own energy policy, often if states are going to build more domestically, it does undercut at least the social welfare tests that Australia has at the moment for additional interconnection, which is again not necessarily a kind of lower system cost outcome. So more active states is something that has to factor into those decisions as well, I think.
Right. Yeah.
To change gears slightly again, so you spent a lot of your career at Origin, and again for our European and US listeners, Origin's one of Australia's big vertically integrated utilities, what's called a gentailer in Australia. And the gentailers, again, not dissimilar to Europe and other jurisdictions, have been having a reasonably tough time in Australia for a variety of different reasons. They've been beaten up by the federal government a little bit when wholesale prices were high. A lot of their coal assets are being undercut by renewables, particularly during the middle of the day. And there's been a move on the retail side to default market offerings. What did you learn at Origin when you were kind of inside the gentailer that's perhaps underappreciated by the rest of the market? And if you were running Origin or a gentailer generally in Australia, what kind of strategy would you be pursuing at the moment to manage some of these risks that are emerging?
Look, I think the word you used towards the end of that question, Hugo, is the critical one, and that's risk. I mentioned it before in relation to the way governments understand risk. Where does risk arise? How is it priced, and who pays for it? And I think that the idea of gentailers, that is companies that would have reasonably large customer bases, energy retailers, and they would very rarely, if ever, own all the generation that would be perfectly matched with their customer base or their demand. What they would do is they'd have some exposure through investment on their own balance sheet. They'd have some exposure through contracted supply, and some of it would be on the market. They would take some market risk exposure, right? And the real challenge for those generator retailer companies is to manage those exposures. And so you will see today companies like AGL and Origin, the two largest private sector companies, or the listed companies in Australia, Energy Australia, which is owned by China Light and Power, is the third biggest. They will have a mixture of various combinations of those, some of it reflecting the historical investments they've made, and some of it reflecting deliberate choice. And so in some parts of the country, a company like Origin might be long on generation, long on supply and short on demand, and vice versa. And they're constantly having to manage that. So some of them, when governments start intervening in the market, and this is where the problems arise, the risks to some of those gentailers become more or less depending upon what the intervention is. So that's where some of them have had difficulty. The second thing is that, as with many parts of the country, and the UK particularly is an example as well, the fundamental idea of retail competition proved to be very difficult because a lot of small retailers, when they're separate retailers and don't have their own generation, in some cases, many cases, they actually don't. The benefits of having more competitors doesn't necessarily mean better competition. It doesn't necessarily mean a better outcome for consumers, because in many cases, all they're doing is adding more costs, because the whole idea of competition is to drive out costs. But if you enter the retail electricity market and you're going to set yourself up a call center, you're going to try and market yourself to more customers, there's very little cost you can take out of the system. In fact, mostly what you do is add costs. And so it was pretty obvious that that's what was going on in Australia. A bit like the UK, there have been various mechanisms attempted to try and do this, to fix this, one of which has been regulation. It's not particularly attractive. It certainly creates challenges for gentailers. So my view is that in the next little while, I think the gentailers are in positions to better manage this transition than most. But what they're going to have to do is manage that risk exposure across the chain, which is fundamentally their strength, to manage across the chain risk, but to be able to make sure that they've got their exposures right. Because right now, navigating through what is a lot of uncoordinated intervention by governments at a state and a federal level. And remember, these big gentails operate across all the jurisdictions pretty well in the Australian market. So whenever an individual jurisdiction changes their rules, these companies have to deal with that, and yet all the other jurisdictions are following a different set of rules. That's a big problem. But I think they're well placed to do it. They're under some pressure, obviously, for the reasons we've mentioned. But I'm confident that they will continue to be the dominant players. And of course, in Australia and many parts of the world, 4, 5, 6 participants is a sort of typical number you're going to see. These don't tend to be deep, liquid markets with hundreds of competitors. That's the nature of the beast, provided they're well regulated, and I don't mean heavily regulated, then I think we can get a good outcome for consumers as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that we probably haven't touched on yet is the role of behind the meter generation in Australia and the extraordinary penetration of rooftop solar, and to a lesser extent, but probably catching up, behind the meter batteries as well. So as more and more consumers kind of go off grid, if you like, that will be tougher and tougher for the gentailers as well. Although they're increasingly trying to move into that space and aggregating up rooftop solar and batteries to create virtual power plants and dispatch those assets into the market as well.
Sure.
Tony, to change tack, so as I said, I think Grattan does terrific work in the energy space. There are obviously, quite a few think tanks in Australia and overseas that are active in the energy and climate space at the moment. How does Grattan think about its role in the debate? Is it to kind of open the Overton window and suggest ideas that are difficult for political parties to get up for kind of fairly pragmatic reasons? Is it to advocate for first best policy, as we've talked about, an integrated energy and emissions policy? How do you think through your role and target the areas you're going to focus on in any given quarter or year?
Look, I think that when Grattan was created, and Grattan's about 11 years old now, there was a view, and I certainly was involved at the time, that there was a need for a centrist economic policy think tank. They exist in other parts of the world. We've had a few politically oriented organisations who do policy work, and we have a few that are very strong ideological think tanks. So whether they're based upon social interests or environmental interests, or even there are quite a number, as you would know, on the climate change side, they have a very strong advocacy role. And they'll often become quite political. What Grattan tries to do is say, well, what really is in the long-term economic interests of Australians? And what are the big issues that would make a difference? What of those issues would lend themselves to better policy? Because there's lots of big issues, but there's other ways of solving it that don't involve government and policy. And then if they've got a big issue where policy is a question, then can the sort of work that we do, which is to take a sharp but relatively deep dive into a question and develop not only an analysis of what the problems are, often quantitatively, but then make clear recommendations for what could be done in the interests of Australians, that's what we try and do. And that means that we sometimes will challenge a particular political perspective. And so, for example, we are very much, not supporters of the idea of a gas-led recovery in Australia. We are very much of the view that first best policy on climate change is the right answer. However, if the politics, and we started this conversation talking about the primacy of politics over policy, if the political imperative of the day dictates that there's no way good policy is going to get up in the short term, then okay, what's the second or third best policy that would head us in the right direction? May not be as efficient, may not be as pretty, may not be as attractive to economic theorists, but would actually help us move. And we're often working in that space. And I think in particular in relation to climate change, that's where we are in Australia, and that's where we'll be for a little while yet. But I still remain optimistic that we can find a way through. So we will always re-emphasise the importance of first best policy, but then accept pragmatically that if we want to make real progress, there's no point in just, I know I've got a lot of friends who work as advocates in various areas, and most of them wear sticking plaster where they've been hitting their head against the wall for so long that it's a mess, right? That's not a great place to be. It's very frustrating.
So, Tony, could I ask another question then? So, what's a belief you had 10 years ago as an energy thinker that turned out to be not correct, or the market has panned out in a very different way from where you anticipated? And then a kind of second and linked question, where do you see a kind of area of market or policy consensus at the moment that you think it will turn out in a very different way in 10 years' time?
Look, I have a bad reputation for not doing forecasts because I'm not very good at it. And I not like in your profession where economic modelling is an incredibly powerful tool, right? I'm quite skeptical about forecasting. I know that's not what good economic modelers do. They don't pretend that they're forecasts, right? They're trying to understand possible futures. Look, I think one of the incredibly generous things the energy and climate change policy has been is to give me something to do for the last 10 years. And that probably has surprised me. I remember when I first joined the energy industry, I thought, well, that's pretty boring. I think we'll just continue to dig the coal out of the ground and produce cheap electricity. What's the problem? And of course, as we know, that turned out to be very different. Now, I present naively back sort of 10 years ago and still today, even today, think that we will find our way back to something closer to first best policy. I think that it's one of those areas we're going to try everything else first, and we'll realize we'll get back there. Now, I'm probably more optimistic now, and Hugo, I know it's already February, but I haven't taken my rose-colored glasses off yet at the beginning of the year, and I remain optimistic that we will manage a transition. I don't think it'll be. I think the challenges, everyone talks about net zero, and we do as well, but there's very few organizations or governments that actually have a clue how they will actually achieve net zero across their economy. Now, if you constrain your net zero to very specific things, often that's pretty easy, right? But if you're talking about the broad issue of an economy, a national economy anywhere in the world, that becomes quite hard, particularly if all you're going to do is outsource your emissions to somebody else. But I'm confident we will make the transition. In electricity, Australia is making remarkable progress. We don't need to subsidise renewable energy anymore. The issue is integrating the renewable energy we've got into the grid, the sort of things we've been talking about, efficiently, so we don't stuff it up. We're more in danger of stuffing it up than of not getting there at all. We do need to concentrate on the other sectors of the economy. And I think, for me, the other area that I think is going to be really interesting, and I don't think we're anywhere near a solution yet, are some of the questions related to the non-electricity emissions. A lot of that stuff will become electrified, but the challenges in some of those areas are very difficult. I know some of the Aurora podcasts have talked about the role of hydrogen. I happen to be a great reader and often a speaker in relation to what is often called hydrogen hype. I think hydrogen will be important, but it'll be a little bit like natural gas. In certain areas, it'll be really important, but it's not a solution to everything. And I think the way that plays out, I think electricity has now become, this sounds a little bit idealistically simplistic, but relatively straightforward. I think dealing with the rest of the economy and remembering Australia, as you said before, is a country for whom fossil fuel exports is really big. We export twice as much carbon as we produce domestically. This is a big deal for us, and the big decisions about the future of our coal industry and even our gas industry won't be made in Canberra or Melbourne or Sydney. They'll be made in Beijing or Delhi or Tokyo. So for us, navigating those areas is where the game is going to be the really interesting challenge. And I hesitate to even suggest that I know how it's going to play out, but I do know there are certain things to watch for, and some of them will be how we start to grapple with the technology developments, where the Prime Minister of Australia is correct. The technology developments associated with addressing the difficult to decarbonise sectors, whether it's hydrogen or somebody else, will be the big game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think CapEx reduction curves on batteries is the one thing we're looking very closely at the moment, and will be a huge swing factor in Australia, given the duck curve and the shape of solar and all those kinds of things. We tend to finish up with this. I always enjoy it, and John Feddersen, our CEO, does it with all his guests. I'm going to give you a few themes and then ask you whether you think they are over or underrated by the market at large. And you can clarify your statement with, hopefully just a kind of one sentence rationale. So over or underrated, policy certainty as a facilitator of investment decisions through the energy transition?
I think it's enormously overrated. Of course, people like revenue certainty from policies, but people make money out of uncertainty. The important issue isn't certainty, it's predictability.
Yeah. The likelihood of Australia getting to net zero in the power sector by 2050, over or underrated by the wider market?
I think it's approximately 100%.
Yep.
I think it might be underrated. Now, net zero is the important question, because I think the last few percents could be at the very high end of the marginal cost abatement cost curve, and I think it might even turn out to be the wrong objective to try and achieve actual zero in the power sector, at least as we know it today.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a final one, tracking announcements globally, particularly in Norway, but also out of China and elsewhere, the penetration of electric vehicles in Australia. In Australia, there's a lot of range anxiety because it's a big country. Do you think current forecasts are over or underrating EV penetration?
I think it's the right EV. There's a big difference between EVs and solar panels and batteries, because they tend to be branded by individual manufacturers of EVs, as opposed to, I don't think anybody could name the brand of PV they've got on their roof. Some might, but they're pretty nerdy, right? Whereas most people, you ask them what sort of car they've got, they don't say, oh, I've got a 4-wheel petrol car. They'll say, I've got an Audi or a BMW or a Hyundai, whatever, right? Yeah. Now, that's the difference. Now, that's important, because what will dictate, I know countries like Norway are doing amazing things with, the way they've supported EVs, but I think it's just going to happen. And, I'm in the market right now myself for a full EV, and I know the challenges of getting them recharged into my apartment building and so on and so forth. But what's going to dictate this, it's happening so quickly that they'll just be bought. And the big challenge for policy and for government is to keep up, because it's not about subsidising the EVs. I think it's a bad idea. I think the best thing the governments need to do is concentrate on the infrastructure. And I don't mean subsidise even the charging stations, because as in the UK, the private sector will build the charging stations to come up with all sorts of interesting ideas on how you'll charge these things. I think it's going to be an enormous change. It's going to happen very quickly, and we can see it happening almost every day. New models of EVs are coming out, the price is coming down, the range is improving. I think it's going to be a fascinating journey, but the biggest impact might be if we ever get anywhere near autonomous vehicles. That will have much more of a social impact than electric vehicles.
No, agreed. I live in Bondi Beach here in Sydney, and all the coolest guys and girls are driving Teslas now, which is usually a good sign of where the next fad in Australia is going to come from. A final question, Tony. Who do you read or listen to in the energy space that you always think is good, thought-provoking, and relevant to the private sector? Anyone spring to mind?
Look, yes, Hugo, there are at least two, and one of them is a person you've worked with in the past, Dieter Helm. He's one of the world's leading climate economists, and I think he does a great job. I wouldn't say I've read all of his books. I certainly don't agree with all of what he says. He says it with an enormous amount of bravado and confidence, as you know, but he challenges my thinking. And I think he's made an enormous impact in the UK, and a lot of that thinking could be shared elsewhere. So I do read his books, and I'm still dipping back into his most recent book on how we stop climate change. The second one is
recently knighted by Her Majesty as well for his services to energy policy as well.
And I would suggest well deserved. The other one is Michael Lobrick. Again, he's somebody from a slightly different perspective who just has a very interesting knack, often even not completely consistent with the current version of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which he created originally, was one of the creators of in the first place. but he just has a great knack of articulating what are the key issues and how fast they're going and where they're going. And I very rarely read one of his pieces without saying, wow, I now understand something a lot better than I did before I started.
Yeah, absolutely. And shows your kind of breadth of intellectual openness, Tony, because those two often disagree with one another quite vehemently as well, which is great.
That's how we all learn, right?
Tony, that's a great place to finish up. Thank you enormously for your time. We've covered a huge amount in, I think, 40 or 45 minutes. We're enormously appreciative. Speak soon, I hope.
Thank you. Enjoyed it enormously.
That was Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in Australia, talking to Tony Wood, Head of the Grattan Institute Energy Programme. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.